Why did they never tell you Alexander's teachers came from Africa? Everything you learned about the greatest conqueror in history was carefully edited to hide one uncomfortable truth: he was a student, not an innovator. And his greatest teachers, they came from the continent they told you contributed nothing to civilization. You're about to discover why 2,000 years of history books have been lying to your face. Alexander didn't invent military genius. He borrowed it from Africa. Picture this: 356 BCE, Macedonia. A young Alexander sits at the feet of Aristotle, absorbing what the world calls Greek wisdom. But here's what they don't tell you: Aristotle himself studied for 13 years in Egypt. 13 years. In the temples of Memphis and Heliopolis, learning from African priests who had been perfecting philosophy, mathematics, and military strategy for millennia before Greece was even a thought. The Egyptians called it the House of Life, Kemet, ancient universities where knowledge flowed like the Nile. When Aristotle arrived, African scholars had already mapped the stars, performed surgery, and developed tactical formations that would later become Alexander's signature moves. The phalanx. African. The siege tactics. Learned from Nubian masters who had been conquering cities while Europeans lived in mud huts. But it gets deeper. Alexander's most trusted general wasn't Greek, he was Ptolemy, whose bloodline traced back to Egypt's royal houses. The man who conquered Persia had African strategic minds planning his every move. They knew the terrain, the people, the weaknesses of empires because Africa had been the center of global trade and diplomacy for centuries. Consider the numbers: Alexander conquered territories spanning 3.2 million square miles in just 13 years. Impossible. Not when you realize he was using African knowledge systems that had already mapped these trade routes. Egyptian merchants had been traveling from the Mediterranean to India for 800 years before Alexander was born. They knew every mountain pass, every seasonal weather pattern, every local alliance that could make or break a campaign. The Library of Alexandria, supposedly the crown jewel of Greek learning. It was built on African soil, staffed by African scholars, housing African texts that had been accumulating wisdom for 3,000 years. When Alexander's generals claimed they were bringing civilization to the world, they were actually distributing knowledge that originated in the Nile Valley. Here's the part that will make you question everything: Alexander's famous tactical brilliance at the Battle of Gaugamela. The pincer movement that crushed Darius. It's identical to strategies depicted in Nubian war reliefs from 1,000 years earlier. The speed of his cavalry charges. Perfected by Ethiopian horsemen who had been dominating warfare since before Greece existed. Even his famous siege of Tyre used engineering techniques that Egyptian architects had developed building the pyramids. The causeway he built to reach the island city. Egyptian engineers had been building similar structures to access temple complexes for centuries. Alexander didn't innovate, he applied existing African engineering to military conquest. But here's where it gets personal for you and me. They rewrote this history because acknowledging African intellectual superiority would have shattered the entire narrative of European exceptionalism. They needed Alexander to be a lone genius, not a student of African masters. They needed Greece to be the birthplace of wisdom, not the recipient of Kemet's generous teaching. The evidence is overwhelming once you know where to look. Greek historians like Herodotus openly admitted that Greeks learned from Egyptians. Plato studied in Egypt for 13 years. Pythagoras spent 22 years learning from African mathematicians. The so-called Golden Age of Athens was built on knowledge imported from Africa. Yet somehow, by the time this story reached your textbooks, Africa had been erased. The greatest conqueror in history became a European miracle instead of what he really was, the product of African intellectual tradition applied to Mediterranean ambition. Think about what this means for you. Every time someone suggests Africa lacks strategic thinking, military genius, or global vision, remember that the world's most famous conqueror succeeded by learning from African masters. Your ancestors weren't sitting on the sidelines of history, they were writing the playbook that shaped it. The next time someone mentions Alexander's greatness, you know the truth. He was great because he learned from Africa. And that knowledge, that wisdom, that strategic brilliance, it runs in your blood, not his. Now you understand why they hid this story for 2,000 years. Follow Ponolens as we continue exposing the truth they never wanted you to discover.